Mark, nice to see you.
Hi, thanks.
So the call from Citi is that the supply chains are not going to ease. That means that the inflationary narrative that we're living with at the moment is going to be longer lasting than we first thought. You live and breathe this stuff. What do you see?
Risks to the upside on interest rates, risks to the upside on inflation. I love the argument that you made and what Andrew was saying. I think what we're seeing in supply chains is very simple. It's definitely exasperated. We all know the issues of Q4. And I do agree it's going to get worse as we move through the second half of this year and into peak season. The reason is quite logical. Obviously, what's going on in Russia and Ukraine is exasperating those problems that we're seeing. Air freight is having to go via the Arctic. That's adding an extra couple of hours to the supply chain. And as a result, what you're doing is you're sucking out supply, raising rates as a result, so air freight rates here, and that's having a knock-on effect to sea freight rates. Simple question. Who's paying for all this stuff?
Well, let's put that question to you. Who is paying for all of that stuff? Is that something that gets passed on to the consumer, or is that something that a lot of these companies have to eventually eat in terms of costs?
Well, Kriti, it's certainly the latter. So I totally agree with your point. If you're looking at the market right now and seeing what the consumer's having to deal with, they're seeing real wages now come under pressure for the first time in the Eurozone and the UK. Up until now, it's all been about wage inflation. Couple their wallet right now with increasing wheat, grain, corn prices, of everything that's happening over in Russia and the Ukraine for obvious reasons, and then couple that with the energy bill that they're having to face and their utility bills at home and the gas that they're putting into their car, and you're seeing H2 set up to be a tough challenge for the consumer potentially.
Do you think companies will be able to pass it all on, though? What do you think when you talk to hauliers, when you talk to the people that are involving moving stuff from A to B to C? Do they think they can pass all of their costs on? Diesel prices are going through the roof. Labour prices are going through the roof. Talk to me about what they're saying to you about their ability to pass those costs on.
It brings up an important point because all of the commentary that we've seen so far in the market has all been about protecting yourself with dividends and buybacks and look for those companies that are paying out cash. The companies that are going to do well in this environment, the ones that have brands that are able to tangibly pass on those consumer costs to their end consumer. So all these inflationary pressures that we're seeing, are they able to pass it onwards? So we're looking at big global brands. They're the companies that are going to win. Clearly, commodity companies are going to win off the back of this as well from a revenue standpoint. And then clearly, companies that provide solutions to the problems in the supply chain are also going to be winners.
GXO.
GXO potentially, right?
Kriti.
Mark, does that mean that you're going to start to see shortages if these sky-high rates are happening, if you start to have commodities really come off the market, especially from Russia, time to rebuild the market share there from the United States and from other sources in the world? Does that mean shortages are in the future when it comes to supply chains?
When it comes to the supply chains, the worst is still to come because you don't initially feel the pinch in the first few weeks of a supply chain shortage. People have inventories. For example, inventories of wheat that are already sitting in the market. They use those inventories up. You really start to feel the pinch when the next harvest hits. That's when the next wave of inflation is going to come through. And the forecasts out there of 7, 8, 9% could easily see 6 or 7% to the upside. That's what we're seeing on the ground.
Okay, let's just deal with what kind of inflation we are seeing. So when it comes to the supply chain story, when it comes to what you expect in the second half of the year, what kind of inflation should we be seeing in supply chains? What are freight rates going to be looking like? How quickly is that ultimately going to get passed on?
So we've seen commodity prices in the last few weeks go upwards of 70 to 100% if you look at those inputs that I talked about, particularly in the agricultural market. If we look at sea freight and air freight rates, right now, you and I talk a lot about what's going on in the port of Los Angeles. The reality is we're nowhere close to peak season. So opining on whether there are a number of vessels sitting
When's peak season?
Peak season always before Christmas, running into Q4.
So that run up to Q4, okay.
So if you run into peak season without having taken an assessment of what's actually happening in Q2 and Q3, that's when you're going to get the biggest pinch. This is not the moment to take a view on what's going on. So what kind of inflation
rate would you be looking for? How tight is it going to get as we come through towards the back end of this year?
It wouldn't be surprising if there are double-digit impacts to the consumer in terms of percentage rates. You're looking at low to mid-teens potentially.
Low to mid-teens. So what is the read-through when it comes to then the end consumer? Are you forecasting demand destruction? Is that what you're going to see at the end of the year?
It's going to be a tale in the second half of differentiation between those global blue chip companies that are able to pass those costs onto their end consumer and companies that are more commoditized that aren't able to pass that on. That will be the story of H2. It's going to be a stock picker's market.
I spoke to the Port of LA the other day, and Gene Soroka was talking about the idea that the shutdowns that we're seeing in China at the moment, caused by COVID,
Shenzhen.
are going to cause are going to allow the market to sort itself out a little bit more. As we see some of the limitations being placed on the China production story, the China transport story, is there a sort of clearing process that allows? And when would we start to expect to see that?
Guy, a number of these companies are in the wrong place to start with. It takes at least 6 months to potentially 2 years to change your supply chain. In the meantime, you've got that supply coming out of the air freight market, and you've got the supply coming out of the container shipping market. These freight rates could go up 30 or 40%.
If the product's not there to ship out of Shenzhen, does that mean that buys the supply chain story a little bit of time?
You potentially, at most, buy yourself 2 months, but you're having to use up inventory that's sitting on the ground in the domestic market in the meantime. Tough story.
So are preparations being made for that then? Buildups of inventory in advance of what you just forecasted, essentially a lot more pain in the back half of the year?
We've got customers falling over themselves to do business with us right now, Kriti. It's a situation whereby people want to outsource to global, technology proficient outsourcers such as ourselves, so third-party logistics providers, and there's a real demand for technology proficiency. That's the key point. People want those robots and cobots that Guy saw in the warehouse over in Nestle over at Christmas. Those are the kind of stories we're having right now. Those are the kind of conversations we're having with our global blue chip customers.
What is the consumer doing right now? Because it was interesting. We had the University of Michigan data out at the start of the last hour, and the indications are that the consumer is feeling cautious from that data. But the reality is, when you look at the retail sales numbers, the consumer is still spending. So the consumer is saying to the University of Michigan, when they come and tap on the door or whatever it is, how they conduct the survey, I'm feeling pretty gloomy, but I've got money in my back pocket and I'm then going to go and spend that. The consumer still has quite a lot of cash and quite a lot of ability to spend. How quickly is that going to get eroded?
Still has quite a lot is the key phrase there. The reality is saving rates are coming down, as you know, as a percentage of the overall wallet. And then on top of that, those real wages are going to be put under pressure by the other factor, which is that your wallet is feeling that cost pinch that we've talked about. That's not a good sign overall for the consumer, but it takes time to work its way through the system. You've bought your fitness bike, you're not going to buy another fitness bike. You've bought your electric car, those durable goods that you've been purchasing over the last year and a half. You've done that. You don't need 2 of those. That's the issue that you're going to face over the next 6 months. You're not going to see it in the January, February, March data. If it happens, it's an H2 phenomenon as we build towards Christmas.
Mark, you keep talking about real wages in particular, but I think Guy made a very good point in that not everyone looks at simply the inflationary pressures and what it means for your end wallet. A lot of people are still getting raises, perhaps not at the same pace as inflation is, but the wealth effect very much is there. Are you saying that perhaps the wealth effect kind of gets eroded as well and loses some of that momentum?
It does, in the middle to lower end as well in particular, Kriti. I think that that's very much the point. When you see food prices going up the way that we're seeing them, when we see input costs like energy and utility bills going up, we're talking about potentially 15 to 30% of the consumer's wallet. So yes, there will be impacts to that.